India is the largest exporter of generic medicines in the world, but that didn't happen by chance. Behind it is a story of colonial trauma, state intervention, and a global vision of health sovereignty. A story that begins in 1947 with independence. Today, India is the world's largest producer of generic medicines, supplying over 50% of global vaccine demand and saving millions of lives with affordable drugs. But how did a country that relied on pharmaceutical imports at its independence in 1947 transform into the pharmacy of the world? So let's take a trip back in time and see how things unfolded. So after independence, India inherited a pretty fragile healthcare system that was completely dependent on Western pharmaceutical multinationals. Our first key figure is Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister. He was a fan of industrial policies aimed at reducing imports and increasing self-sufficiency. But he wasn't particularly keen on the pharma sector. You see, he thought it was a little too dependent on science and technology, which were better left to the private sector. As a result, India continued to import most of its drugs and even some basic ingredients like aspirin. In 1950, over 90% of medicines were imported and only 7% of bulk drugs were made domestically. It was an embarrassing situation for a country of India's size and population. So much so that one American publication said, India is 40 years behind the U.S. in drug production. Now, this didn't sit well with Indians, especially since they were constantly being told to buy expensive imported drugs instead of locally produced ones. But then came the twist. Countries like the US and the UK started pressuring India to maintain drug patents and keep the pharma sector under foreign control. Why? Because if India developed its own pharmaceutical industry, it could become a competitor. And who wants that? Not the imperialists. By the early 1960s, Nehru's government had established 5 state-owned pharmaceutical companies, including the influential IDPL, Indian Drugs and Pharmaceuticals Limited. These companies produced life-saving drugs: tetracycline for the 1994 plague outbreak, doxycycline for leptospirosis in 2005, and chloroquine for the decades-long battle against malaria. But the real magic happened when public knowledge met private ambition. Anyway, in 1970, Indira Gandhi's government and her health minister, Dr. Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, decided enough was enough. They passed the Indian Patents Act, which allowed for the production of copies of foreign drugs as long as the manufacturing process differed from the original. This opened the floodgates. Suddenly, companies like Cipla, Dr. Reddy's, and Ranbaxy popped up churning out affordable generics. And by 1980, India was making 70% of the medicines it needed. But this success didn't come without its share of hurdles. The U.S., along with other Western powers, exerted significant influence on the Indian government, threatening sanctions over what they termed as patent violations. Yet India stood firm, refusing to be bullied. And let me tell you why they had every right to resist. The year is 1990, and the world is in the grip of an emerging health crisis, the full scope of which wouldn't be apparent for several more years. We're talking about the AIDS pandemic. But that's not news. What might be surprising, though, is that while antiretroviral drugs were available in the West, costing around $10,000 per year, they were virtually inaccessible to most of the developing world due to their high cost. India saw this crisis as an opportunity to step in and make a difference. In 2001, India's pharmaceutical industry made a groundbreaking move. It began producing generic versions of these life-saving drugs for just $1 per day per pill. This move was a game changer. It provided a ray of hope to millions in Africa and Latin America who were previously priced out of accessing essential medications. But who was behind this move? Enter our next key figure, Yusuf Hamid. He was the chairman of Cipla, one of India's leading pharmaceutical companies. When the world was grappling with the impact of the AIDS pandemic, he dared to go against the might of Big Pharma. He understood the potential of India's pharmaceutical industry to produce affordable generic drugs for those in need, and he took a bold stand. When other companies hesitated, Cipla stepped up, offering to supply the anti-AIDS drug at a significantly reduced price of just $1 a day. This decision was not just a business move, it was a humanitarian gesture. At the time, the cost of antiretroviral therapy in the developing world was around $12,000 per person per year. But Hamed's offer brought that down to just $360. This drastic reduction in cost made a huge difference in providing accessible treatment to many more people. In the following years, Yusuf Hamid's efforts paid off immensely. By 2005, India was supplying 80% of the drugs used to treat HIV/AIDS to poor nations. His actions didn't go unnoticed. He received numerous accolades, including the coveted Padma Bhushan from the Indian government and the rank of Officer de l'Ordre National du Mérite from the French government. His story is a testament to the power of compassion and the impact one person can have on the world. Despite all the good work India was doing, the US and the EU weren't exactly thrilled about India's stance on patents. They kept accusing India of pharmaceutical piracy and unfair competition. But India stayed strong. It was clear that they would rather prioritize the health of their people and other developing countries over Western complaints. Then came the ultimate test, the COVID-19 pandemic. Indian firms played a pivotal role in vaccine diplomacy during the pandemic, manufacturing Covishield, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, among others. India became a global distribution hub, exporting vaccines to over 100 countries. However, a spanner was thrown in the works when the U.S. export banned raw materials to India in April 2021, impacting vaccine production. But India managed to bounce back. It diversified its sources of raw materials and resumed exports in record time. Today, India stands tall as the world's largest producer of generic drugs. It exports to more than 200 countries and earns around $50 billion annually from its pharma industry. India has clearly demonstrated that it can hold its own in the global market without compromising on quality or affordability. This begs the question, why should profits take precedence over people's lives? The incredible journey of India, from a nation that couldn't produce its own medicines to becoming the world's generic drug powerhouse, is a remarkable tale. It's a testament to what can be achieved when a country dares to dream big, invests in science, and prioritizes the health and well-being of its citizens. The story of India also holds valuable lessons for the rest of the world, especially the global South. It shows how standing up to imperialist pressures and taking bold steps to secure public health can lead to positive outcomes. 1/3 of the world's population still lacks access to essential medicines. But India's journey serves as a beacon of hope, proving that with determination and the right policies, we can overcome even the most daunting challenges. What began as a response to colonialism became a model for health sovereignty, not just for India, but for the entire global South. In a world where access to medicine is still a matter of life and death, India's pharmaceutical revolution reminds us another model is possible. And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel to keep thinking the world how it really is.